Hello, I'm Cothrix, and today I want to share some information with you and hopefully help you decide what kind of gear you want in ArcheAge. The purpose of this guide isn't to go into detail about every single item in ArcheAge. Instead, I'm going to show new players some of the options they have, while at the same time showing experienced players how different kinds of armors and weapons relate to each other. Also, keep in mind that everything is compared based only on raw stats. Set bonuses and extra effects aren't being compared because their effectiveness is determined by your class. If you want to look at items in more detail, I suggest using ArcheAge database. The database is a very useful resource and I use it all the time. Alright, so you've just hit level 50 and now you want to get started on some in-game items. The great thing about ArcheAge is you don't have to wait until the level cap at 55 to do so. In fact, the first set of in-game armor, Illustrious, can be equipped at level 44, and most other items only require level 50. For the most part, armor and weapons fall into 4 different categories: crafted, obsidian, world drops, and dungeon gear. Crafted items are the overall best, but most expensive as well. Crafted items can be upgraded into higher tiers, but only if it's a certain type. The type of item is randomly determined when it's initially crafted, so some can be upgraded and some are stuck at a standstill. Crafted items don't bind when equipped, so you can freely trade them around. Obsidian items are also crafted, but it's much less expensive to do so. They can always be upgraded, though after tier 3 you will need to choose one of 2 paths stat-wise. Obsidian items are bind on equip, but upgrading them unbinds them. Overall, obsidian items fall right below crafted items in terms of power. World drops come from various world bosses, and more recently entire sets of armor can now be obtained one piece at a time from any mob at Aurora. Most of these world bosses aren't particularly hard, and since you can farm Aurora mobs alone, they are easy to get. World drops are bind on equip, so it's easy to get them from the auction house as well. However, they cannot be upgraded and they are quite a bit less powerful than obsidian or crafted. Finally, dungeon armor sets come from Greater Howling Abyss or Serpentis. These are a little more difficult to get and bind on pickup. They're about as powerful as world drops, but have fairly good set bonuses depending on your class. Your most important pieces of gear are your weapons. In fact, these 3 slots make up about half of your overall gear score. Majority of your focus should be spent on weapons, as many classes can do extremely well even with poor armor, as long as they have good weapons. Here you can see a simple listing of non-regraded weapons and their DPS. The percentages on the right are how they relate to Ionad, which is the top tier. We can see that Ionad weapons are quite a bit more powerful than even T6 Obsidian. If there was one item to go all out on, it would be an Ionad weapon. This shows a better representation of power levels. As you can see, there is a very steep increase after Delphinad. Because high tier crafted weapons are the most expensive items in the game, the best path for most players is going to be the Obsidian weapons. These weapons are still very good and are much easier to obtain. They are crafted by the players themselves, and each tier uses the previous tier as materials. This allows players to gradually upgrade their obsidian weapons over time instead of needing to replace a weapon altogether. Other than a few rare dungeon drops, your only other option are Aurora drops, which are fairly pitiful. Hasla, which is easily outclassed by obsidian and isn't worth the effort, and library weapons, which are extremely rare. Unfortunately, Hellkist weapons were part of an event and aren't obtainable anymore, but maybe they will bring them back in the future. Overall, obsidian weapons will be the best choice for most players because tier 1 is very easy to make and you can slowly upgrade as you play. Also, be aware that each different kind of weapon has a hidden passive. You'll want to pick the type of weapon you want based on what will be best for your class. The short spear and katana are very popular choices for DPS classes, while the sword is ideal for tanking. Some of the obsidian weapons also have bonus stats for various classes, such as plus healing or plus magic. These are just bonuses and aren't in place of higher DPS or something, so don't worry if your class doesn't use them. After weapons, your next most important pieces of gear are your main 7 armor pieces. Here's a list of most types of armor in the game and how they relate to each other. I'm not counting things like set bonuses or any special use effects armor might have, and I'm just going by raw stats. So what you're seeing here might vary a little bit depending on your class, but it should still give you a good general idea. The percentages on the right are how each piece relates to Ionad armor in terms of strength. If you want the absolute best, you'll have to go with crafted armor. As the name suggests, this armor is crafted by players and uses previous tiers as crafting material, but only if they are of a certain type. This armor also doesn't bind when you equip it, meaning that if you're done with it and want to move on to a higher tier, you can resell it. Ionad armor is the best in the game, but it's also by far the most expensive. In fact, crafted armor becomes out of reach for most players even at the Ethereum level, which is why for most players, obsidian armor is a better choice. Obsidian armor is also crafted, but it uses materials that are bind on pickup, and the armor itself binds when equipped. Basically, you will mostly need to make obsidian armor yourself, but overall it's much cheaper. Obsidian armor also passes up Ethereum by the time it reaches Cursed, known as Tier 3, and Tier 3 is far less expensive than Ethereum. Obsidian armor also uses previous tiers as crafting material. After tier 3, obsidian armor branches off into two paths, so you'll have to decide which one to go down. And if you do get all the way to tier 6, you will only be about 5% away from Ionad, which probably isn't going to make a massive impact. Tier 3 obsidian is what many players have and is a very good goal to shoot for. The only issue with obsidian gear is that it only fills 5 out of 7 slots. You'll need to find something else for your wrist and belt pieces. There are also a few armor sets from world bosses, but they require a raid to complete and aren't very good. I wouldn't suggest striving for one of these sets as your first, as obsidian will take far less time to get and is generally better. You can go after the Aurora gear just by killing mobs anywhere in Aurora and trying to get them as random drops. Aurora gear isn't upgradable though, and it isn't great when compared to other high-end armor, but it is essentially free and far better than quest gear. Aurora gear also fills the gaps for certain classes and may be the best choice for those. Unfortunately, dungeon gear has taken quite a back seat to crafted gear. It's not nearly as good and is more difficult to get than obsidian. For certain roles, such as tanks, the Serpentis plate set is quite good, so it might be a better choice. It may also be worth getting at least the Serpentis set, because it's now possible to combine entire sets of dungeon and world boss gear into bracers and belts. These are to fill the gaps left in obsidian gear, and they are quite good, on par with tier 4 obsidian in terms of raw stats, and feature extra effects that push them even higher. Overall, my recommendation for armor is to go for tier 3 obsidian and magnificent bracers and belt. The reason for magnificent is because it's the least expensive level 50 crafted gear that you can get. In terms of overall effort, they are much easier to get than the set crafted bracers and belt. They can also be gemmed with special Aurora gems that the Aurora bracers and belt can't be. These gems are actually more important than the armor itself in some cases, because bracers and belts give such minimal stats. Accessories are probably the least important pieces of gear, so don't worry too much about them, especially if you have other priorities like weapons. When it comes to accessories, there are only a few choices. You want to obtain the Dream Ring, which is a long quest chain started by defeating the last boss in Serpentis. You also want to either get the Library Earring, started by the quest chain from killing Lurker Keeper Wynn in the Ionad Library, or the Pioneer Earring from using 2000 Prestige in the Guild Shop. After that, fill in the gaps with crafted gear. For a necklace, the best in slot for almost every class is the one obtainable with warrior medals. You'll need several hundred in order to make a decent tier necklace, and keep in mind that each time you craft up a new level, it has a chance to slip back to a lower rank. It's a pain, but well worth it in the end. You can also turn in 300 warrior medals for class-specific instruments, but for certain classes, obsidian or even world drops might be better. As for capes, there is really only one choice, which is to buy the guild capes with prestige. These are the best capes in the game and are upgraded with mob drops instead of the normal regrade scrolls. If you aren't in a guild that has high enough level to obtain the guild capes, you can trade grinding for Aurora capes, which are just inferior versions of the same capes. The Aurora capes come from haunted chests, which have about 1 in 1,000 drop rate from any mob in Aurora, so good luck. There are numerous gems and enchantments in ArcheAge, and like many things in the game, they are made out to be needlessly confusing. When I talk about gems, I mean multiple items that can be socketed into a single item, and when I say enchantment, I'm talking about an item where only one of its type can be applied to a piece of equipment. The game calls gems Luna Scales and Luna Gems, and the game calls enchantments Luna Frost and Luna Drops. It also refers to Luna Stones at times, which it seems to use interchangeably. There's a long list of various kinds of gems and enchantments. The main thing to remember is that enchantments always work and gems don't. Gems tend to explode out of the items if you try to cram more than 2 in at a time, so good luck. If you craft your item up to another tier, it does not keep its gems and enchantments. I would focus on enchantments first, since they never fail, and only start gemming your gear when you have little else to upgrade. You can go about gemming 2 ways, either go with cheap, low-tier gems and try to put in as many as possible, or buy expensive gems and be happy with 2 or 3 in a piece of gear. Regrading an item will open more gem slots, so be aware of that as well. Regrading is where a lot of your money will be spent in ArcheAge. There are 12 different grades in the game. I've already made a guide to regrading, so I won't go into a lot of detail here, but typically what you want to shoot for is Celestial Armor and a Divine Weapon. Most players, even high-end players with 5k gear score, wear Celestial Armor. As I said before, your weapons are your most important pieces of gear, so shooting for a Divine is probably a good idea. If you don't want to go through the hassle and heartache of trying to regrade that high, you can typically buy Divine Weapons for about as much as they would cost on average to regrade yourself. A very important note about regrading armor is that if you wear at least 4 pieces of armor of a certain grade, you will receive a special buff for it. Each piece of gear you regrade adds to the buff, so it's worth regrading even things like belts and bracers, just for the extra bonuses. For whatever reason, wearing any gear at Arcane or higher downgrades your buff to that level. So if you're going for Celestial, keep as much of your gear rare as you can and upgrade each piece to Celestial individually. That way you can have an early Celestial buff that will only get better as you regrade more gear. It's very important to keep in mind that regrading gets more expensive when used on higher tier items. That being the case, if you're going after Obsidian gear, it's typically best to keep your items at tier 1, regrade them as high as you want, and then upgrade them to tier 2 and beyond. This will be the cheapest method of regrading. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this guide, or at least that it's helped you decide what kind of gear you want to go for. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to get back to you. And if you want to keep up with my videos, remember to subscribe. I'm Cothrix, and thanks for watching.